The early morning sun barely pierced through the dense fog at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The terminal buzzed with its usual chaos, crying babies, rushed businesspeople, and the occasional announcement echoing through the speakers. Among the crowd stood a distinguished-looking man in his mid-50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, wearing a simple brown leather jacket and carrying a worn-out messenger bag. Captain Raj Kumar had spent the last 30 years of his life in the cockpit, commanding some of the most sophisticated aircraft across the globe. Today, however, he wasn't wearing his uniform or 4 stripes. He was traveling as a regular passenger to attend his daughter's graduation ceremony in San Francisco. The check-in counter of Valuewings Airlines was particularly crowded that morning. As Raj waited patiently in line, he couldn't help but notice the growing tension between the airline staff and frustrated passengers. A young gate agent, who couldn't have been more than 25, was clearly overwhelmed by the situation. When it was finally Raj's turn, he approached with a gentle smile. "Good morning," he said, placing his ID and ticket on the counter. The gate agent, whose name tag read Priya, barely looked up from her computer screen. Her fingers tapped aggressively on the keyboard as she spoke in a dismissive tone, "Your carry-on seems oversized. You'll need to check it in." Raj glanced at his standard-sized bag, knowing it met all regulations. "I believe there must be some mistake. I've been flying with this bag for years. Sir," Priya cut him off sharply, her voice dripping with condescension, "I don't have time for arguments. Either check the bag or miss your flight. Those are your options." The surrounding passengers watched uncomfortably as the scene unfolded. Raj maintained his composure, drawing from years of experience handling high-pressure situations. "I understand you're under stress, but perhaps we could measure the bag to confirm. Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job?" Priya's voice rose, attracting more attention. "Let me guess, you think you know better than airline staff? You probably don't even know how to tell a Boeing from an Airbus." A few snickers emerged from the growing crowd of onlookers. Raj felt his cheeks warm, not from embarrassment but from concern about how this young professional was representing the aviation industry he'd dedicated his life to. Still, he remained calm, remembering the countless times he'd taught young pilots about grace under pressure. Actually, he began softly, reaching for his professional ID in his wallet, but Priya wasn't interested. "Security," she called out, pointing at Raj. "This passenger is being difficult and refusing to comply with airline policies." 2 security officers approached swiftly. Raj could feel his daughter's disappointed face flashing in his mind. If he didn't make this flight, he'd miss her big day. The thought of not being there when she received her medical degree made his heart sink. "Ma'am," one of the security officers started, recognizing Raj immediately. "That's Captain Kumar. He's one of the most respected pilots in the industry." The color drained from Priya's face as she finally looked at Raj properly. Her eyes widened as she recognized the man whose picture hung in the airline's training center, where she'd completed her orientation just months ago. The same man who had written half the safety protocols she was supposed to follow. I am so sorry, Captain," she stammered, her earlier arrogance evaporating. "I had no idea." Raj raised his hand gently. "We all have difficult days. Let's move forward and focus on getting these good people to their destination safely." He gestured to the long line behind him. The security officers helped expedite the process, and soon Raj was walking toward his gate, his properly sized carry-on rolling behind him. As he walked away, he could hear Priya's supervisor giving her a stern talking to about professional conduct and making assumptions about passengers. Settling into the waiting area, Raj pulled out his phone to check the weather report for their flight path. Something about the forecast caught his attention, a strange pattern he'd seen only a few times in his 3 decades of flying. He made a mental note to keep an eye on it during the flight. Little did anyone know that Priya's humiliating encounter with the off-duty pilot would soon become the least of their concerns. As passengers continued boarding the aircraft, the weather system Raj had noticed was developing into something far more significant than the standard forecast suggested. The next few hours would test everyone on board, and the line between passenger and pilot would blur in ways no one could anticipate. Looking out the terminal window at the massive Boeing 787 that would carry them to San Francisco, Raj couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be anything but routine. His instincts, honed by countless hours in the cockpit, were telling him to stay alert. Those same instincts had saved lives before, and as the first drops of rain began to hit the terminal windows, he silently hoped he wouldn't need to rely on them today. The boarding process proceeded smoothly despite the deteriorating weather outside. Raj found himself in seat 14C, an aisle seat that gave him a clear view of both the wing and the cabin. As passengers settled in around him, he noticed the flight attendants rushing through their pre-flight checks with unusual haste. Through the thin cabin walls, he could hear the intensifying drumbeat of rain. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in brief, stark bursts. A young mother across the aisle clutched her toddler closer with each thunderclap. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," a voice crackled through the intercom. "We're expecting some turbulence during our flight to San Francisco, but we've adjusted our route to avoid the worst of it. Our flight time today will be approximately 4 hours and 15 minutes. Raj's trained ear caught something in the captain's voice, a subtle tension that passengers might miss but that any experienced pilot would recognize. He pulled out his tablet, checking the weather radar one last time before the mandatory device shut down. The storm system had evolved into something more complex than he'd initially observed. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Raj felt the familiar vibrations beneath his feet. But something was off, a slight irregularity in the engine sound that made him furrow his brow. 20 minutes into the flight, his suspicions were confirmed when the aircraft made an unusual correction during climb. The first hour passed with increasing turbulence. Passengers gripped their armrests as the plane bucked and swayed through rough air. The seatbelt sign had remained illuminated since takeoff, and flight attendants remained strapped in their jump seats, their usual drink service impossible in the conditions. Suddenly, a violent shudder ran through the aircraft. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and several passengers gasped. Raj's hand instinctively went to his armrest, his mind automatically running through emergency procedures. The intercom crackled to life again, but this time it was the first officer speaking. "Cabin crew, please prepare for immediate descent." The coded message sent chills through Raj's spine. Something was seriously wrong. Minutes later, the aircraft banked sharply left. Through the window, Raj could see the left engine struggling, its rhythm completely off now. A flight attendant hurried past, her practiced smile betraying underlying panic. Then he saw her, Priya, from the check-in counter. She was working the flight as a backup crew member, her earlier bravado replaced by visible fear as she clung to a cabin handhold during another bout of turbulence. The captain's voice returned, noticeably strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our left engine. As a precaution, we'll be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." The cabin erupted in worried murmurs. A businessman across the aisle began hyperventilating. The young mother's toddler started crying. Through the chaos, Raj noticed the flight attendants exchanging concerned glances. They knew this was more serious than the captain was letting on. Another violent shudder rocked the plane, stronger than before. The aircraft dropped several hundred feet in seconds, causing unrestrained items to float momentarily. Screams filled the cabin. Oxygen masks deployed, dangling like yellow flowers in a surreal garden. In the midst of the chaos, a flight attendant recognized Raj. She rushed to his seat, her voice trembling. "Captain Kumar, both pilots are." She glanced around nervously, incapacitated. "Severe food poisoning. We need your help." Raj unbuckled his seatbelt without hesitation. As he stood, his eyes met Priya's, who watched in disbelief as the passenger she'd humiliated earlier rose to take command of the failing aircraft. Making his way to the cockpit, Raj could feel the aircraft's struggling systems through the floor. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Both pilots were pale and barely conscious, victims of what appeared to be a severe reaction to their crew meals. Taking the captain's seat, Raj quickly assessed the situation. The left engine was failing catastrophically, threatening to take the right one with it. The storm system had them trapped, with severe wind shear all around. The nearest airport was Denver International, but reaching it would require threading through the worst of the weather. As he gripped the controls, Raj thought of his daughter waiting in San Francisco, of the young mother and her toddler in row 15, of Priya and her lesson in humility. They were all counting on him now, whether they knew it or not. The next few minutes would determine all their fates, and Raj knew that every second of his 30 years of experience would be put to the ultimate test. As another lightning bolt illuminated the dark clouds ahead, he took a deep breath and began the most challenging flight of his career, one that had started with a simple trip to his daughter's graduation and had turned into a desperate race against time, weather, and mechanical failure. The cockpit was eerily quiet except for the constant drone of the failing engine and the steady patter of rain against the windshield. Raj's fingers danced across the controls with practiced precision, his mind racing through years of training and experience. Denver Control, this is Valuewings 437, declaring an emergency. Raj spoke into his headset, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Both pilots incapacitated, operating under passenger pilot authority. Left engine failing, severe weather conditions. The response came immediately. Valuewings 437, Roger, your emergency. Vectors for immediate approach to runway 16R. Weather deteriorating rapidly in your sector. A flight attendant entered the cockpit, her name tag reading Anjali. Captain, passengers are secured, but we have several requiring medical attention. The turbulence. Get everyone in brace position, Raj instructed, his eyes fixed on the instruments. And find someone with medical experience if possible. Our original pilots need attention. The aircraft shuddered violently again. Warning lights flickered across the panel as the left engine's condition worsened. They were now flying essentially on one engine, through one of the worst storms Raj had ever encountered. In the cabin, Priya moved from row to row, helping passengers adjust their oxygen masks and checking seatbelts. Her earlier arrogance had been replaced by a determined focus on her duties. Every few minutes, her eyes would drift toward the cockpit, the weight of her morning behavior heavy on her conscience. A particularly violent gust of wind threw the aircraft sideways. Raj fought with the controls, his forearms straining as he manually corrected their course. The navigation systems were becoming increasingly unreliable due to the storm's intensity. Valuewings 437, be advised, severe wind shear reported on approach path. All other traffic has been diverted. Emergency vehicles standing by. Raj quickly calculated their options. Their current approach would take them through the heart of the storm. The alternative was a longer route that would burn more fuel they might not have with the failing engine consuming more than normal. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the dark clouds ahead like an apocalyptic landscape. In that brief moment of clarity, Raj spotted something that made his heart skip, a narrow corridor of relatively calm air, barely visible between the storm cells. It was a risky maneuver, one that would require perfect timing and execution. One wrong move, and the already struggling aircraft would be caught in potentially catastrophic wind shear. But it was their best chance. Denver Control, Valuewings 437 requesting deviation from assigned approach. I see a weather window 3 degrees west of current course. There was a pause before the response came. Valuewings 437, deviation approved at your discretion. Local radar confirms your observation. Proceed with caution. In the cabin, the young mother had managed to calm her toddler, who now slept despite the turbulence. The businessperson who had been hyperventilating was now helping an elderly passenger with her oxygen mask. Humanity's best qualities often emerged in its darkest moments. Priya made her way to the cockpit, steeling herself before entering. "Captain, is there anything we can do to help?" Raj glanced at her briefly, noting the genuine concern in her eyes. "Yes. Get on the intercom. Tell everyone we're making our approach. It's going to be rough, but we're going to make it." As Priya turned to leave, Raj added, "And Priya? You're doing a good job. Real professionals admit their mistakes and learn from them." The young woman's eyes welled with tears as she nodded and left to make the announcement. Her voice over the intercom was clear and confident, bringing comfort to the frightened passengers. The aircraft began its descent through the narrow weather corridor Raj had spotted. The turbulence was severe but manageable. The failing engine groaned in protest as Raj carefully managed their power settings. Suddenly, multiple warning alarms blared through the cockpit. The left engine had finally given out completely, and the right engine was showing signs of strain from compensating. They were still 10 minutes from the runway, now flying on borrowed time. Denver's runway lights appeared in the distance, a beacon of hope in the storm. But between them and safety lay the most challenging part of their journey, the final approach with a dead engine, through wind-shear conditions, in near-zero visibility. Raj's world narrowed to his instruments and the feel of the aircraft under his hands. Every bit of knowledge, every hour of experience, every lesson learned over 30 years of flying would be put to use in the next few minutes. As the ground proximity warning system began its countdown, he took a deep breath and began the final phase of their desperate flight to safety. The runway lights flickered through sheets of rain as Raj guided the crippled aircraft toward Denver International. The altimeter spun downward while warning systems blared their desperate chorus. With one engine dead and the other struggling, every movement of the controls required precise calculation. 1,000 feet, the automated system announced emotionlessly. In the cabin, Anjali's voice rang clear, "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Passengers tucked their heads against their knees, gripping seat bottoms with white-knuckled hands. The young mother wrapped herself protectively around her toddler, whispering prayers. 700 feet. A violent crosswind slammed into the aircraft's right side. Raj fought the controls, his decades of experience flowing through his hands as he corrected their course. The runway disappeared momentarily behind a curtain of rain, then reappeared, slightly offset. 500 feet. The remaining engine coughed ominously. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel like angry fireflies. They were coming in too fast, but with the failing engine, reducing speed further could be catastrophic. Value wings 437, wind shear alert on final approach. All emergency vehicles in position. Priya gripped her jump seat, watching the cockpit door. The passenger she'd humiliated hours ago was now their only hope for survival. The irony wasn't lost on her as she thought about her morning behavior, wondering if she'd live to make amends. 300 feet. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ground below in stark relief. The crosswind intensified, pushing them off the centerline. Raj's arms strained against the controls as he wrestled the aircraft back on course. 200 feet. The right engine's warning light began flashing. They were asking too much of it, but they had no choice. The ground rushed up to meet them through the rain-streaked windscreen. 100 feet. Time seemed to slow. In that moment, Raj thought of his daughter. Her graduation ceremony would begin in a few hours. He had promised to be there, to see her receive her medical degree. The thought steeled his resolve. 50 feet. The aircraft lurched suddenly as the right engine finally gave out. They were coming in dead stick now, essentially a glider with the aerodynamics of a brick. Raj's world narrowed to the runway ahead and the feel of the aircraft around him. 30 feet. The ground proximity warning blared as they descended too quickly. Raj pulled back slightly on the controls, trading their precious remaining speed for a gentler descent. 20 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath them. They were slightly off-center, but there was no time to correct. It would have to be good enough. 10 feet. Time snapped back to normal speed as the main landing gear slammed into the runway. The aircraft bounced once, twice, the fuselage groaning under the stress. The reverse thrusters were useless without engine power. They were still moving too fast. Raj stood on the brake pedals as the aircraft shuddered violently. Rain-slicked runway stretched ahead, but their speed was still too high. The end of the runway approached rapidly, emergency vehicles racing alongside with lights flashing through the downpour. The aircraft began to skid. Raj fought to keep it straight, knowing any sideways movement at this speed would be disastrous. The brake temperature warnings screamed as the wheels threatened to lock up. Finally, mercifully, their speed began to drop. The aircraft slowed, then slowed some more, until they were crawling along the runway. They came to a stop mere 100 feet from the runway's end, smoke rising from their brakes into the rain. For a moment, complete silence filled the cabin. Then, as if a dam had broken, cheers and sobs of relief erupted from the passengers. People hugged strangers sitting next to them, crying and laughing simultaneously. Raj sat motionless in the captain's seat, his hands still gripping the controls. 30 years of flying, and he'd never experienced anything quite like this. His arms trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. The cockpit door opened, and Priya stepped in. Her eyes were red from crying, her uniform soaked with sweat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she simply placed a hand on Raj's shoulder and squeezed gently. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their lights painting the rain in red and blue. The storm continued to rage, but inside, a different kind of storm had passed. As medical teams rushed to attend to the original pilots, Raj finally released his grip on the controls. He checked his watch. There might still be time to make it to San Francisco for his daughter's graduation. After all, he had promised to be there, and Captain Raj Kumar always kept his promises. The terminal at Denver International buzzed with controlled chaos as emergency personnel, airline officials, and media representatives swarmed around Gate B-17. Inside a hastily arranged conference room, Raj sat quietly, his worn messenger bag still by his side, as airline executives peppered him with questions about the emergency landing. The preliminary data shows you flew through a corridor that wasn't on our radar, the airline's chief of operations said, spreading weather maps across the table. How did you know it was there? Raj smiled quietly, remembering countless monsoon seasons flying in his home country. Experience teaches you to read the storm's personality. Every storm has weak points, you just need to know where to look. The door burst open, and a man in an expensive suit rushed in. Captain Kumar, I'm the CEO of Value Wings. What you did today, there aren't words. He paused, catching his breath. We've arranged a private jet to take you to San Francisco. You'll make your daughter's graduation with time to spare. Before Raj could respond, another commotion arose outside. Through the glass walls, he could see the young mother from the flight, still clutching her toddler. She was speaking animatedly to reporters, tears streaming down her face. He wasn't even supposed to be flying the plane, her voice carried through the door. He was just a passenger, someone the airline staff had treated terribly at check-in. But when everything went wrong, he saved all our lives without hesitation. The CEO's face darkened at the mention of the check-in incident. His eyes scanned the room until they found Priya, who stood quietly in a corner, her uniform still wrinkled from the ordeal. To everyone's surprise, Raj spoke up. The mark of a true professional isn't never making mistakes, he said, looking directly at Priya. It's how they learn from them. Your gate agent showed remarkable courage during the emergency. She put passengers first and performed her duties admirably. That's what matters most. Priya's eyes welled with tears for the second time that day, but for entirely different reasons. The CEO looked between them, understanding dawning on his face. A knock on the door interrupted the moment. The original pilots had been treated and were well enough to make a brief appearance. They looked pale but grateful as they approached Raj. "We heard you threaded the needle through that storm on one engine," the captain said, extending his hand. "That's the stuff of legends, sir. They'll be teaching this landing in flight schools for years." The businessperson who had been hyperventilating during the flight appeared at the door. He seemed transformed, calm and collected now. "Captain Kumar? The passengers, we'd like to thank you properly." Raj followed him out to find the gate area packed with his fellow passengers. As he emerged, they burst into applause. The elderly passenger whom the businessperson had helped waved her phone. She'd been live-streaming their landing on social media, and the video had already gone viral. "My grandson's an aspiring pilot," she called out. "He's watching this right now. You've inspired an entire generation today." The young mother stepped forward, her toddler now awake and curious. "We've started something," she said, showing Raj her phone. A hashtag was trending, #BelikeRaj, accompanying stories of everyday kindness and professionalism in the face of prejudice and pressure. Amidst the celebration, Raj checked his watch again. The private jet would get him to San Francisco just in time, but there was one more thing he needed to do. He made his way through the crowd to where Priya stood. "I have a request," he said quietly. "Would you serve as my flight attendant to San Francisco? I think we both have more to learn from each other." Before she could respond, their attention was drawn to the terminal windows. Outside, the storm was finally clearing. A brilliant rainbow arced across the sky, seeming to connect Denver to San Francisco. As the crowd gathered to admire the sight, Raj noticed something remarkable. People who had been strangers hours ago were now standing together like old friends, sharing photos and contact information. The events of that day had done more than just save lives, they had reminded everyone of their shared humanity. In an age of increasing division, a moment of crisis had brought out the best in everyone, from the businessperson helping the elderly passenger, to Priya's courage in facing her mistakes, to the passengers coming together as a community. The private jet gleamed under the airport lights as Raj and Priya climbed aboard. The luxury interior was a stark contrast to the commercial aircraft they'd landed hours earlier, but neither of them seemed to notice. Both were lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. "Coffee, sir?" Priya asked as they reached cruising altitude, falling back on her training to mask her nervousness. "Please," Raj smiled. "And please, call me Raj. I think we've been through enough today to drop the formalities." As she prepared the coffee, her hands trembled slightly. "I keep thinking about this morning," she said quietly. "How differently everything could have turned out if you hadn't been rude to me at check-in." Raj finished her sentence. "Perhaps. But then you might not have learned the lesson that made you such an exceptional crew member during the emergency." The jet soared above the clouds, leaving the storm behind. Below them, the landscape changed from the Rockies to the Nevada desert. They had about an hour before reaching San Francisco. "I've read about you in our training materials," Priya said, settling into the seat across from him. 30 years of flying, never a single incident. Until today." She paused. "How did you stay so calm?" Raj looked out the window, gathering his thoughts. "Early in my career, I flew relief missions during natural disasters. One thing I learned, panic doesn't help anyone. The key is to focus on what you can control." His phone buzzed with a news alert. Someone had posted footage of their landing in Denver, captured by the airport's cameras. The video showed their aircraft emerging from the storm, landing gear down, smoke trailing from both engines. "They're calling it the Miracle of Denver," Priya said, showing her own phone. The hashtag #BelikeRaj had evolved into a movement, with people sharing stories of grace under pressure and forgiveness in the face of prejudice. "No miracle," Raj shook his head. "Just training, experience, and a crew that performed their duties excellently when it mattered most." The intercom crackled. "Sir, we're receiving a message from your daughter in San Francisco." The pilot patched it through. "Papa?" His daughter's voice filled the cabin. "I just saw the news." "Are you really okay?" "I'm fine, Beta," he assured her. "And I'll be there in time for your graduation. I promised, remember?" There was a pause. "Papa, they want me to mention you in my graduation speech. About how you saved all those lives just hours before coming to see me become a doctor." Raj felt tears forming in his eyes. "Tell them about the whole crew," he said. "About how people can rise above their mistakes and prejudices. About how crisis shows us who we really are." The rest of the flight passed in contemplative silence. Priya served another round of coffee, this time without any trembling in her hands. She had found her confidence again, but it was different now, tempered by humility and understanding. As they began their descent into San Francisco, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The Golden Gate Bridge emerged from the evening haze, a symbol of connections made and distances bridged. "I've been thinking," Raj said as they approached the airport. "Valuewing's training program could use someone who understands both sides of the story, how it feels to make mistakes and how to redeem them." Priya looked at him questioningly. "I'm recommending you for a position in our training department," he continued. "Your experience today will be invaluable in teaching others about true professionalism and grace under pressure." Tears welled up in Priya's eyes again, but she blinked them away professionally. "Thank you, sir. Raj. For everything." As the jet touched down smoothly at SFO, Raj could see a crowd gathered at the private terminal. News of the Denver landing had spread fast. But among the reporters and onlookers, he spotted the one face he'd been longing to see, his daughter, still in her graduation robe, having come straight from the rehearsal. The day had begun with a simple check-in confrontation and had transformed into something much more significant. It had become a story of redemption, of second chances, and of the extraordinary moments that can emerge from ordinary days. The University of California, San Francisco's graduation ceremony was already underway when Raj slipped quietly into the auditorium. His daughter's message had spread through the graduating class, and heads turned as he made his way to his reserved seat in the front row. The dean herself had insisted on it after hearing about the events in Denver. The ceremony paused briefly as the crowd recognized him. A spontaneous round of applause erupted, causing Raj to duck his head modestly. He caught sight of Priya, who had been invited to attend, standing at the back of the hall. She gave him a small nod. They both knew this moment wasn't about their story, but about his daughter's achievement. "And now," the dean announced, "I invite our valedictorian, Dr. Ayesha Kumar, to deliver her address." Raj's heart swelled with pride as his daughter approached the podium. She looked exactly like her mother in that moment, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity. The gold honors cord around her neck caught the light as she adjusted the microphone. "My prepared speech was about dedication to healing," Ayesha began, "about the years of study and sacrifice that brought us here. But today, I learned a different lesson about what it truly means to save lives." She paused, finding her father's eyes in the crowd. "Hours ago, my father was just another passenger on a flight to be here today. When he was treated poorly at check-in, he responded with dignity. When both pilots fell ill and the engines failed in a storm, he stepped up without hesitation. Not because it was his job that day, it wasn't. He did it because that's who he is." The hall was silent now, every person hanging on her words. "That's the kind of doctor I want to be. Someone who helps not because it's their shift, but because they can. Someone who remains professional even when others don't. Someone who sees beyond prejudice and past mistakes to recognize the potential in others. From the back of the hall, Priya wiped away tears. On her phone, messages were pouring in from her colleagues at Value Wings. The video of the landing had become a training tool, not to shame her, but to show how people could grow from their mistakes. My father taught me that heroism isn't about the big moments, Aisha continued. It's about the small choices we make every day. How we treat people when we're stressed. How we react when others treat us poorly. How we rise to challenges we never expected to face. She gestured to the graduating class. As we become doctors today, we're not just gaining titles or privileges. We're accepting a responsibility to be our best selves, even on our worst days. To see the humanity in every patient, even the difficult ones. To rise to occasions we never trained for. The crowd burst into applause, but Aisha wasn't finished. Dad, she said, her voice softening. You promised you'd be here today, and you kept that promise against impossible odds. But you did something even more important. You showed me, and the world, what it truly means to live up to our professional oaths. As she stepped down from the podium, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. But Raj barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, seeing not just the doctor she had become, but the human being she had always been. After the ceremony, as graduates and families mingled, Raj found himself surrounded by Aisha's classmates. Many had already watched the footage from Denver, and their questions weren't about the technical aspects of the landing, but about the human elements of the story. How did you stay so professional after being treated poorly? One asked. What made you forgive the gate agent so readily? Wondered another. Raj looked over at Priya, who was deep in conversation with Aisha. Because everyone deserves a chance to show their better self, he said simply. Sometimes they just need the right moment to do it. The story of Value Wings Flight 437 would indeed be taught in flight schools, but not just for its technical aspects. It would become a lesson in humanity, in professional ethics, and in the power of forgiveness. It would remind future pilots and medical professionals alike that their true test isn't just in their technical skills, but in their ability to maintain their humanity under pressure. 1 year later, Raj stood at the front of Value Wings Training Center, addressing a new class of aviation professionals. The room was packed, not just with flight crew trainees, but with medical students from UCSF as well. The joint training program had been his daughter's idea, bringing together aviation and medical professionals to learn about crisis management and professional ethics. Professional excellence isn't just about technical skills, he said, gesturing to the screen behind him showing the footage from Flight 437. It's about maintaining your humanity in challenging moments. In the front row, Priya sat straight-backed in her new uniform as the head of Value Wings' professional development program. The airline's CEO had taken Raj's recommendation seriously, recognizing that her unique experience made her the perfect person to teach others about growth and redemption. Today's guest speaker, Raj continued, is someone who demonstrated extraordinary courage, not just in a crisis, but in facing her own mistakes. He nodded to Priya, who stood and took his place at the podium. A year ago, I was a gate agent who let stress and prejudice cloud my judgment, she began. The room was silent, every person recognizing the woman from the viral video. By the end of that day, I had learned what true professionalism means, thanks to a man who had every right to hold a grudge, but chose to show compassion instead. The doors opened, and familiar faces entered, the young mother and her toddler, now a year older, the businessperson who had helped the elderly passenger, and several other survivors from Flight 437. They had all become regular speakers at these training sessions, each sharing their perspective on that remarkable day. The world has changed since Flight 437, Priya continued. Airlines have revised their training protocols. Medical schools have incorporated our story into their ethics curriculum. But the most important change has been in how people view everyday interactions. On the screen, a montage played, security footage from airports around the world showing moments of kindness between staff and passengers, doctors going above and beyond for difficult patients, people choosing compassion over confrontation. At the back of the room, Dr. Aisha Kumar watched proudly. Her residency at San Francisco General Hospital had been shaped by the lessons from that day. Her patients often recognized her name, and she would share her father's story to help them understand that everyone, even healthcare providers, could have bad days, but it was how they rose above them that mattered. The young mother's toddler, now able to walk, suddenly broke free and ran up to Raj, arms outstretched. The room laughed as he scooped up the child, remembering how the mother had protected him during the landing. They had all become an unlikely family, bound together by their shared experience. The miracle of Flight 437 wasn't just the landing, Priya concluded. It was what happened afterward. How one person's example of grace under pressure inspired others to be better, to do better. After the session, as the attendees filed out, the elderly passenger who had live-streamed the landing approached Raj. "My grandson graduates from flight school next month," she beamed. "He says you're the reason he chose aviation." Raj smiled, remembering his own journey. "Tell him the sky's not the limit, it's the beginning." Later that evening, Raj sat in his favorite chair at home, looking through messages from Flight 437 survivors. They had stayed in touch, supporting each other, sharing life updates. The businessperson had started a foundation providing scholarships for underprivileged students interested in aviation or medicine. The young mother had become an advocate for airline safety and professional development. His phone buzzed, a message from Aisha. She was treating a difficult patient who had been rude to the hospital staff. "Remembered your check-in story," she wrote. "Showed him extra kindness. He just apologized to everyone. #BeLikeRaj still works, Dad." Raj looked out his window at the setting sun, reflecting on how a single day had created such lasting change. The story of Flight 437 had evolved beyond a tale of heroism into a lesson about the power of human dignity, forgiveness, and the choice to rise above our worst moments to reveal our best selves. On his desk lay an invitation. Valuewings was establishing the Kumar Excellence in Aviation Award, recognizing crew members who demonstrated exceptional professionalism and humanity in challenging situations. The first recipient would be Priya, a testament to how far she had come from that morning at the check-in counter. The legacy of Flight 437 lived on, not just in training manuals and safety protocols, but in countless small moments of kindness and professional courtesy. It had become a reminder that every interaction, every decision, every moment of forgiveness could ripple out to touch lives in ways we might never expect. As night fell over San Francisco, Raj thought about tomorrow's training session, knowing that somewhere in that room would be another person whose life would be changed by this story. Because sometimes the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles flown or emergencies handled, but in the hearts touched and the lives transformed along the way.